A week before my son's wedding, I stood in my kitchen with flour on my hands when the air shifted. Voices drifted in from the patio. Laughter. A syrupy tone that stayed sweet when aimed at me and sharp when it thought I was not listening. I stilled. My heart stopped. I edged to the window and hid behind the curtain like a girl who knows lightning is about to touch down. I heard my name first. Then I heard the plan. They would keep me busy with the children. All of them. 15 by the last count. Babies to teenagers. While the adults danced and posed for pictures and toasted a love that did not include my seat at the table. My son Derek spoke with the easy pride of a man in love. "Mom is an angel," he said. "She still has the energy." I bit my tongue until I tasted metal. The bride-to-be let out a soft laugh and told her sister that I was perfect for the job. Free. Experienced. Invisible. I pressed my palm to the cool glass. Outside, the sky had that butter gold light that makes every porch look holy. Inside my chest, something old cracked. I have buried a husband. I have raised a boy into a man. I have kept a small business alive through winters that tried to swallow it. I know what it feels like to be tired and still carry a family on your back. But I had never felt what I felt in that moment. The sting of being turned from mother to unpaid help. I stepped away from the window and stared at the counter. Sugar. Butter. A sack of potatoes. 3 chickens to brine for a recipe that belongs to the women who came before me. A menu for 150 guests that I promise from the softness of my heart and the savings of my purse. $3,000. Weeks of planning. Late nights at the dining table with a pencil behind my ear and church music low and steady in the background. Their laughter drifted in again. This time it carried words that burned. Keep her busy so she does not interrupt important conversations. She will not even realize she is being used. Men are naive. The old woman will do it with a smile. My breath came short. I pulled the curtain wider and saw Derek hang up his phone and slide his arm around his bride. He did not hear the edge in her voice. I did. It sounded like a door closing. It sounded like a place I had built with kindness being locked from the inside. I wanted to storm out and set the record straight. I wanted to raise my voice and count every cake I had baked, and every bill I had paid, and every mile I had driven in the middle of the night to rescue a son who now forgot my name when it was time to give respect. But I stood still. I thought about the women who raised me. I heard my mother's voice say, "Do not beg anyone to see you. Stand up and let the truth show itself." So I breathed. I wiped the flour from my fingers. I folded the shopping list and slid it under the sugar canister. I put the kettle on because hot water helps a heart decide. I looked at the coral dress hanging on my closet door, and I saw the woman I have been trying to find again. Not the servant. Not the silent helper. The matriarch. Here is the first truth. Love is not servitude. Here is the second truth. A boundary is not a betrayal. Here is the third truth. If you treat a woman like she is invisible, she will teach you how to see. My phone buzzed on the counter with a new message from Derek about cake stands and delivery times. I let it buzz. I watched the steam rise from the kettle and curl like a ribbon, and it felt like a sign. The plan they thought they made for me unraveled in my hands. Because I do not run after 15 children at a wedding where I am not invited to sit. I do not starve while serving. I do not smile while being erased. I reached for a clean sheet of paper. I wrote, "Dear Derek," and I chose my words the way a surgeon chooses a blade. Precise. Calm. Final. By the time you read this, I will be resting. I prepared to bless your day. Then I learned my role in your plan. I canceled what I paid for. I will see you after the celebration. With love but with dignity. Mom. I slipped the note under the place where he always sets his keys when he visits. I packed a small bag. I called Rosalind and told her I needed a day for my soul. She said, "Say the word and I am there." I said morning. By the next morning I acted normal. I poured coffee. I packed small gift bags. I smiled when Monique sent me a text with a string of hearts and a line about color palettes. But under that quiet I was working. Years of running my own diner had trained me to keep ledgers in my head. Every expense. Every promise. I opened my notebook, the brown one with grease stains from 2008, and wrote 3 columns. Paid. Promised. Owed. The list spoke loud. $3,000 gone to catering. $500 to flowers. 20 hours of unpaid labor. That morning I checked my emails from the vendors. I wanted to be sure every invoice had my name on it, not theirs. It did. The caterer had even noted in his message, "Thank you, Mrs. Cole, for covering the family buffet." I took screenshots and printed copies. You do not live 67 years without learning that paper speaks when people lie. At noon I drove to Rosalind's house. She poured sweet tea and said I looked like someone planning either a murder or a miracle. I told her what I heard. She leaned back and whistled. "Girl, you gave them everything and they still want your time." She said sometimes the lesson has to cost them something. Her words settled like a key turning in a lock. That night I replayed the patio conversation in my mind. Every phrase was a bruise. I needed to see if I imagined it. So I walked to my porch where their voices had echoed and recorded the next call Monique made on speaker while I watered my plants. She was confirming with her sister how many children were on the list. 15. One toddler with allergies. I whispered into the dark, "You will not risk those babies with your arrogance." The next day Derek stopped by for a sandwich. He kissed my cheek. He told me not to stress and mentioned how grateful they were that I was taking care of the kids. My hands trembled but I smiled. "How many little ones will there be, son?" I asked. He said around 15, maybe more, but you are great with children, Mom. You always find peace in the chaos. I laughed softly and answered I used to. He didn't notice the change in my tone. After he left I sat at the dining table and opened my late husband's toolbox where I keep our old legal files. There was the deed of the house, the will, and a yellow envelope marked wedding refunds. I added my vendor receipts to it. If they tried to twist the story, I wanted facts. Betrayal hurts less when you turn it into evidence. That evening the church ladies stopped by to drop off hymn sheets. I asked if they heard about Derek's wedding. Betty said she was excited for it but rolled her eyes when she mentioned how the young bride wanted everything grand but nothing paid up front. The more they spoke, the clearer the pattern grew. It was not just a plan to use me. It was Monique's habit to make others do her work. I felt my stomach twist. I decided to test her. I texted that the buffet might need a deposit from her end. She replied within a minute, "No worries, Mom, we will settle after." Heart emoji. I stared at the screen until the bubble of laughter I kept buried turned bitter. After dinner I opened my laptop and checked my bank balance. The number sat low, but enough for me to walk away clean if I chose to. I printed cancellation policies. I highlighted the clauses. I imagined their faces when they found out there was no food coming. Then guilt crept in. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they didn't mean harm. But the echo of their laughter said otherwise. I prayed, "Lord, show me truth without my pride in the way." When I opened my eyes, the answer was there. The truth had already shown itself. The next morning I called each vendor and asked simple questions about refunds and deadlines. The florist said they could release half back if canceled within 48 hours. The caterer said no problem as long as it was me calling because my card was on file. I thanked them and hung up. Every click of the receiver felt like a stitch being pulled from an old wound. Later that afternoon Rosalind dropped off a manila folder labeled Boundaries. Inside were printed copies of sample letters she used at the community center for women who needed to say no. At the top she had written in blue ink, "You owe no one free labor." I smiled. Betrayal had turned into a classroom. My investigation was my healing. As I folded the papers I thought about my son's face when he was little, covered in biscuit crumbs, looking at me like I could fix anything. I whispered to that memory, "Mama still fixes things, but now she fixes herself." I closed the folder, set it beside the kettle, and looked out at the same window where the first wound opened. The porch was empty now, quiet except for crickets. I realized silence can be a tool. It can be louder than any confrontation. Tomorrow I would use it. At dawn I sat at my kitchen table with a plain cup of coffee and the brown ledger open to a fresh page, and I told myself to plan like a woman who has survived storms and knows how to chart a path through hard water, not like a mother begging for respect that should come without asking. So I drew 3 lines on the page and wrote Step 1 cancel, Step 2 withdraw, Step 3 communicate, and under each I listed what courage would look like in daily actions that even a weary body could carry. Because I had learned that courage is not fireworks but small precise choices made before the world wakes up. Step 1 meant calling every vendor whose invoice sat in my manila folder and reclaiming my money and my time before anyone could try to claim it for me again. Step 2 meant taking myself out of reach so that last-minute tears and pleas could not pull me back into the old role. And step 3 meant a letter that would be undeniable and clean and steady like a pastor reading scripture. A letter that set the boundary without drawing blood. I read the list 3 times until the words stopped shaking inside me, and then I started with the florist because flowers feel softer than food and I wanted to warm my voice before I reached the call that would hurt the most. The one to the caterer whose checklist still sat on my counter with notes about chafing dishes and lemon wedges and the timing of the hot pans. The florist answered on the second ring with a cheerful good morning and asked about peonies and eucalyptus, and I said in the calmest tone I could find that I needed to cancel the order for Saturday. And when she hesitated I told her it was a family change and that I would accept the policy as written, half back because we were inside the window, and I felt the strange relief that comes when you choose yourself even if it costs you, like loosening a tight shoe and feeling blood return to your toes. She thanked me for being gracious and promised to process the refund by noon, and I thanked her for her help and set the phone down and took one long breath. Next came the rental company for the buffet tables and the cream linens and the extra heaters for the courtyard. And that man was practical and brisk and said, "No problem, Mrs. Cole, as long as the card on file was yours," which it is, and I said it is, and he told me he would reverse the charge minus a small fee, and I said that would be fine, and then I wrote the exact numbers in the ledger because I wanted to be able to tell myself later that I handled this with order, not spite. I looked at the clock and let the house stay quiet as the sun tilted through the blinds in slow stripes, and I thought about how many mornings I had given away to other people and how good it felt to give this one back to myself. Then I dialed the caterer, the one whose family I had known for years, a kind man who once sent extra rolls because he knew my church loved second helpings. And for a moment my voice caught because kindness can break you open faster than cruelty, but I pressed my palm flat on the table and spoke clearly. "Good morning, this is Henrietta Cole. I need to cancel the full buffet for Saturday. There has been a family change and I will accept the cancellation terms as written." And he was quiet and then asked if everything was all right. And I said yes, everything is becoming what it needs to be, and he said he respected that and that because the order was large he would refund all but the cost of certain perishable items, and I said I understood and thanked him for his generosity. And when I hung up I realized my hands had stopped shaking. I stood and moved through my kitchen like I was sweeping an old stage clean, picking up place cards and ribbon spools and mini clothespins for the photo line and putting them into a box marked return because even small symbols of unpaid labor can prick you when you are not looking. The box filled fast and I closed the lid and slid it into the hall closet and felt my shoulders drop an inch lower, the way your body lowers the weight once the boulder is off. After the calls I turned to step 2 and texted Rosalind because I knew that staying in town would be a trap, not because I am weak, but because love is a strong rope and sons will tug it without knowing they are tying you back to the same post. So I wrote, "Sister, I need a place with quiet water and steam and soft robes and no cell service for a few hours at a time," and she sent back a link to a spa by the lake that we had once promised to visit after the choir fundraiser but never did. She said say when, and I said Saturday morning, and she replied done and added a row of little sun emojis because she knows I like to pretend I do not need cheering and she also knows I always do. We pooled a plan like women who have planned many things and had to rescue those plans from other people. We would leave at 7 with small bags and full hearts. We would check in and turn off phones and order what we wanted from a menu with no prices because the price I had already paid was higher than any lunch could be. We would sit by the lake and let the wind do what wind does to tired faces. We would return Sunday evening after the wedding smoke had cleared. I wrote step 2 complete on the ledger and felt a spark of joy that I did not try to hide from myself. Step 3 would be the letter, and that needed the right pen and the right table and the right voice. The voice I use when I tell truth to younger women who are trying to build a backbone after years of carrying everyone else. So I cleared a space at the dining table and set a sheet of good paper in front of me and placed the pen beside it and waited until my breath was slow and even. Before writing I walked through the house and gathered what needed to be put away so that panic could not talk me out of my plan. The borrowed cake stands back into their boxes, the bags of sugar stacked neatly in the pantry, the recipe card slid into the wooden box where my mother's handwriting lives like a hymn. Then I returned to the table and began, "Dear Derek, by the time you read this I will be resting by the water. For months I prepared to bless your wedding because I love you. Yesterday I learned that my role in your celebration was not to be your mother who sits and shares joy but to be a free babysitter for 15 children while others enjoyed the food I paid for. I cannot accept that role. I have cancelled the buffet and the extras I ordered. I hope you find a quick solution. I will be home on Sunday evening. I love you but I love myself too, your mother Henrietta." I paused and read it aloud and checked my commas like a teacher because good punctuation can keep a heart from spilling. and I saw that I had said all that needed saying and nothing that would burn what I still hoped could be redeemed. I signed my name the way my husband liked to see it on the holiday cards and wiped the single tear that made a shiny dot at the edge of the H. Then I folded the letter and placed it under the blue ceramic dish where Derek always drops his keys, a spot his body finds without thinking, so the letter would find his hands without me. When the ink was dry, I made 2 copies for my folder, not because I planned to fight but because women like me have learned to document the truth, so we do not have to repeat ourselves when the story gets retold by people who were not there. With the letter done, the practical work came easy. I checked the bank app and saw the refunds pending, and I moved the numbers into new columns that made me feel like a steward of my life again. Then I wrote a short checklist for Saturday morning so I would not forget my medicines or my coral dress, because I wanted to put it in the suitcase as a promise to myself that I would wear it soon to a place where I was invited to be seen. Around noon, Derek texted to ask if he should pick up the extra ice, and I typed "give me a minute" and then set the phone face down because a minute can stretch into an old habit if you let it, and I needed to keep my promise to myself. So I washed the mixing bowls and put them away. I wiped the counters until they shone. I opened the window and let the crisp air roll in until my curtains fluttered like choir robes in a slow song. The house sounded like peace, a peace I did not notice I had been missing for months while I let my days be scheduled by everyone else. I realized how often women my age disappear into service and how easy it is for people to treat a steady hand like a faucet that never runs dry. And I told myself no more, not in anger but in clarity. The afternoon brought a visit from Rosalind with a tote bag full of small kindness, hand cream that smells like lemon, a paperback novel with a woman on the cover looking out at the sea, a tin of butter cookies, and she set them on my table and listened while I read the letter to her in a steady voice. She nodded and said, "It is clean and it is kind and it is firm. That is the holy trinity for a boundary." And we both laughed because truth wrapped in humor goes down easier. Then she asked about practicals and I showed her the ledger and the refunds and the policy printouts, and she whistled under her breath and said, "You could teach a class at the community center," and I said, "Maybe I will." And she said, "After you rest you will," and I said, "Amen." Before she left, she checked the oil in her sedan and cleared the back seat for our bags and promised to be in my driveway at 7 sharp. And we hugged on the porch where the first cut had been made days ago and sealed it with sisterhood. Then I watched her walk back across the lawn and felt how the ground can hold you when a friend stands on it with you. Evening came soft and blue, and I cooked myself a small supper and ate it slowly at the table where the letter waited under the dish, and I thought about my husband and what he would say. He would say, "You did right, hen. You teach people how to treat you, and it is never too late to change the lesson." And I smiled because I could hear his voice as clear as the day he taught Derek to ride a bike. He ran behind that boy and then let go, and Derek wobbled and did not know yet that he could do it alone. Maybe that is what this is, a new letting go, a lesson for my son and a lesson for me. After supper I packed my bag smart, 2 dresses and soft shoes, and the coral dress folded like a secret, a sweater for evening chill, a silk scarf that smells faintly of lavender, my medicine in a small zip case, my worn Bible with notes in the margins, the ledger because I wanted to carry the proof of my own good stewardship, and a small picture of Derek at 6 years old covered in biscuit crumbs. A reminder that love can be simple and that the boy I raised still lives inside the man who forgot himself for a moment. I placed the bag by the door and put my phone on silent and then on the charger across the room so I would have to stand up to reach it, a trick I learned to protect myself from reflexes. Then I sat in my favorite chair and let the quiet gather. Not the heavy quiet of tension but the restful kind that hears crickets and the far-off hum of a city getting ready for a weekend. I let my shoulders drop again and felt tired in a good way. The kind of tired that comes from doing the right thing even when it costs you something, and I whispered thank you for courage under my breath. Later I wrote a small list of what I would say if Derek came to the door before I left. It was not an argument but a script of peace. "Son, I love you. I heard what I heard. A mother is not the help. If you want to talk we will talk on Sunday. For now please respect my rest." And I practiced those lines in a mirror once because sometimes the mouth needs to know what the heart has decided. Sleep came like a friend, and in the night I dreamed of a lake like a sheet of glass and a sky swept clean, and I woke before my alarm, made tea, showered, and slipped the coral dress into a garment bag so it would not wrinkle. Then I placed the letter on the table and slid the blue dish over it just enough that the edge peeked out, the way a bookmark peeks from a well-loved book, and I stood there a long moment, long enough for the rising sun to dust the envelope with light. And I felt a strong calm I have only felt a few times in my life. Once when I signed the papers to buy my diner, once when I signed them to sell it and knew it was time, and now when I chose to stop being the person other people assign and to start being the woman I know. At exactly 7 I heard Rosalind's horn and I picked up my bag and my purse and my keys and I glanced once at the kitchen that had fed so many people and I whispered I will feed myself today and I locked the door and walked toward the car with steps that did not hurry, because I was not running from anything. I was walking toward peace and that is a different kind of speed. As we pulled away I looked back at the porch and felt no fear that I had gone too far. I felt instead the rightness of a road that leads out and a promise to return only when respect is waiting on the other side. And I rested my hand on the tote with the lemon cream and thought how good it is when a plan is simple and clean and finished in your bones before the day even begins. We reached the lake a little after 9 and the morning mist lifted from the water like a veil while the pines along the shore stood quiet as ushers. The spa lobby smelled of citrus and clean linen. Rosalind squeezed my hand and said we are checking in for rest not escape. I nodded because she was right. Escape is for someone who is running. Rest is for someone who has finally stopped. We signed our names and a young woman in a white uniform offered chilled water with lemon and spoke in a voice that felt like a cool cloth on the forehead. She led us to a room with soft robes and a small balcony over the water. I set my phone face down on the table and turned it to silent. For a moment I watched the screen as if it were a restless child, and then I left it there and refused to parent it. I thought of the letter under the blue dish and felt the steady certainty that comes when you have already spoken the truth. The first treatment was hot stones along the spine and the table was warm and the music sounded like wind sliding through tall grass. I closed my eyes. Breathe in. Breathe out. I let the heat find tired places I had hidden from myself. The therapist asked, "Is the pressure all right?" and I said, "Yes, it is perfect." When she worked the knots between my shoulder blades, I remembered nights in the diner when I carried crates of potatoes up the back steps because my prep cook had called out, and someone needed to feed the lunch crowd. I remembered lifting Derek when he was 5 and fell asleep in the car, and I carried him into the house because he curled into my neck like a warm loaf of bread. The heat moved down my arms and the old aches softened. When the session ended, the therapist draped a towel over my shoulders and whispered, "Take your time." I dressed slowly and stepped out to the balcony. The lake was blue glass. A heron skimmed low as if writing a careful line across the morning. Rosalind came out beside me with a grin and said, "You look 10 years lighter." I said, "So do you." We laughed the way women laugh when they have both survived something and can finally say it out loud without breaking. We ordered lunch in the cafe and I let myself choose without looking at the price because I remembered that I had already paid for a buffet I would not serve. The soup tasted of roasted tomatoes and thyme. The bread was warm. I ate it slowly and thought this is what it means to feed yourself first and not apologize. After lunch we walked the path along the shore. A breeze lifted the fringe of my scarf and carried the smell of pine and clean water. I felt the quiet press its hand to my back and guide me forward. Around noon I turned the phone on to check the time and the screen lit up like a small storm. 17 missed calls from Derek. 8 texts. 3 calls from Monique. A message from an unknown number. The device buzzed again as if it had been holding its breath. I looked at Rosalind. She lifted her eyebrows. I said, "I will read them once. Then I will choose peace." I opened the thread. "Mom, where are you? Mom, we have been calling you all morning. Mom, I found your letter, call me please. Mom, the wedding starts in an hour. Mom, where is the food? The guests are arriving. Mama, please." The last text arrived 15 minutes earlier. "Mom, I know you are mad, but there are 15 children here and the parents want to know who is watching them." I felt a sting of old habit in my chest. The part of me that fixes everything reached for my shoes. Then I closed my eyes and let that part sit down. I dialed Derek. He answered on the first ring with the voice of a child who has just seen a house of cards fall. "Mom, where are you?" I said, "Hello son, I am at a beautiful spa by the lake with Rosalind, and they have chocolate massages and herbal steam and water that looks like a prayer. How is your wedding?" He said, "Mom, this cannot be happening. The guests are already here. There is no food. The photographer is asking about the family shots and Tiffany is crying." I said, "Did you read my letter?" He said, "Yes, but I thought you were upset and would calm down." I said, "I am calm. I am also clear. I canceled the buffet when I learned that my role was not to be your mother who sits and enjoys, but the woman who runs after 15 children while others eat what I paid for." He was quiet long enough for me to hear a swell of voices behind him and the sound of a child crying and the thud of something heavy dropped on a table. Then he said, "Mom, please, we will pay you. We will give you $500 if you come watch the kids." I let a small laugh rise because the number tasted like a bargain for a soul. $500 Derek. A moment ago it was a family favor no one asked me if I wanted to do. Now that you see the hole you want me to fill it with my body and call it love. He said 2,000. We will give you 2,000. I said son, if you had 2,000 for me today you had enough to hire a caterer last month and spare me the debt and the labor. You chose the path that cost me most because I always say yes. He said Mom, the cake just fell. I heard another voice shout and then Monique took the phone. Charlotte, you cannot do this to us. You promised the buffet. There are 150 people here. I kept my voice even. I promised the buffet when I believed I was a guest of honor, not unpaid staff and certainly not a nanny. As the saying goes, labor is paid. I never charged you. She said the children are running everywhere and parents are angry. I said I imagine it is difficult. I understand you have a sister. What is her name? Audrey. I hear she thinks I am very good with children. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to see the shape of the truth settling in her. Then she whispered, how do you know? I said walls have ears, sweetheart, especially when people talk loudly on my patio. She said, can we discuss this later, please come now. I said you do not need anything from me right now. What you need is a professional. The going rate is at least $10 per child per hour. 15 children for 6 hours is $900. That is a bargain compared to $3,000 I put down for your food. In the distance a child wailed and someone cursed and a chair scraped across the floor. Monique hissed, our wedding is ruined. I said your wedding is honest now. That is different. The phone rustled and Derek returned with a voice that had dropped into old shame. Mom, did you really hear us on the patio? I said I heard that I am an old woman who is useful to keep busy, so I do not interrupt important conversations. I heard that I would not even notice being used because I am always willing. I heard that I am like a free professional nanny for the whole night. He said nothing. I could hear his breath and I could hear something else too. The slow cracking sound of a story he told himself about who his mother is. I said, Derek, listen to me. I love you more than my own comfort. That has been true for 45 years. But love is not servitude. Respect is not optional. I want you to have the wedding you deserve. I also want you to have the lesson you need. He whispered, Mom, please come. I said no. He tried again. He said, at least come for the pictures. I said, pictures lie. I will come when the truth is welcome. He began to cry. Then I heard a woman asking in the background, where is the person who is supposed to watch the kids? My son is in the kitchen, and he just knocked a tray of cupcakes onto the floor. I said, son, your show has begun. Call a sitter service. Call 5. Pay them what they ask. This is what planning looks like. He said, will you ever forgive me? I said, forgiveness is a road built with steps, not a word said in panic. We will talk on Sunday. I hung up and placed the phone face down. Rosalind had been sitting across from me with both hands around her mug as if holding heat. She exhaled and said that was a master class. I said it was a boundary. She said that is what I said. A server brought 2 glasses of white wine to the terrace and asked if we were celebrating anything special. I said yes. We are celebrating independence. She smiled and left us with a small plate of olives and a dish of almonds. The lake kept shining as if it had heard our conversation and approved. For 3 hours we surrendered to the place. A facial that smelled of cucumber and clean cotton. A steam room with eucalyptus that cleared the chest and made room for a longer breath. I lay on a chaise in a quiet room with magazines I did not read because the ceiling painted with clouds was enough story. I thought of every woman who had swallowed her no and paid the price later with her health or her spirit. I prayed for them by name when I could and by memory when I could not. At 3 I turned my phone on again. The screen filled with new messages. 17 more calls. Mom, we ordered pizza for everyone. It cost $1,200 and people are angry about the wait. Mom, 3 parents left with their children. Mom, Tiffany says you ruined her day. An unknown number. Miss Cole, this is Carol, the mother of a child here. They told us there would be childcare and there is none. Several of us are leaving. I want you to know what they did to you is not right. Another number. Miss Cole, this is Michael Ballantyne. Please come help my daughter. She is devastated. I read them all. I felt the old ache and the new steel live in the same rib cage. I typed one reply to Derek. Son, I love you. A mother is not the help. We will talk on Sunday. I set the phone down and looked at Rosalind. She lifted her glass. To peace, she said. To peace, I echoed. At 5 my phone rang again and the name on the screen was Derek. But I let it roll to voicemail because I knew there was nothing left to negotiate. The rule was simple. I do not work where I am not honored. We walked to the water and stood with our shoes in the sand and the small waves washed over our toes. Rosalind said, "Say it out loud so it sticks." I said, "I am not unpaid labor. I am a mother. I am a woman. I am allowed to choose." The words felt like keys in a lock. They turned and the gate opened. Twilight came like a soft shawl. We ate dinner in the dining room by a window where the lamps outside made coins of light on the water. I chose salmon with lemon and Rosalind chose roast chicken, and we shared a small dessert because joy multiplies when shared. My phone lay face down beside my napkin and I did not lift it. I wanted to taste the food my own money bought from my own mouth without watching anyone else eat first. After dinner we sat on the terrace wrapped in blankets. The air had cooled. Somewhere out on the lake a small boat moved with a single light. I thought of Derek as a child with a flashlight in a blanket fort, and I felt the familiar tug of my heart to rescue. Then I let the tug loosen. He is a man. He must learn. At 8 I checked messages one last time. There were photos from a cousin who loved drama more than propriety. The cake lay in a sad heap. A cluster of children sat under the head table with crumbs on their faces. A woman in a silver dress looked furious while speaking to a waiter. The caption read, "Girl you would not believe." I put the phone down and laughed until tears came. Then I wiped my eyes because I do not enjoy other people's pain. What I enjoyed was the truth finally standing in daylight. At 9 Derek texted again. "Mom, the wedding is over. It was a disaster. The kids broke 2 centerpieces and stained a dress. Tiffany's sister watched some of them and now she is angry. Tiffany says she will never forgive me because my mother ruined her wedding." I let the words sit. Then I typed a single answer. "Son, it is precisely because I love you that I will not let you treat me like an employee. A son who loves his mother does not plan her labor without asking. A husband who loves his wife does not train her to use his mother. We can rebuild if you want to rebuild with respect. Good night." I turned the phone off and listened to the water. I thought of the first time I felt truly alone after my husband died and how I survived that. I thought of every Sunday I stood in the choir and sang "It Is Well With My Soul," and how the words were sometimes a promise more than a feeling. Tonight they were both. I slept like a woman who has finished a long shift and turned the sign to closed. In the morning I woke before dawn and stepped onto the balcony while the lake wore a thin silver scarf of fog. A bird called and another answered. I brewed tea in the small kettle and poured it into a white cup, and let the steam curl up into the cool air. Rosalind knocked softly and came out with her blanket around her shoulders. We stood there in a silence that felt like church before the first note. When the sun cracked the horizon she said, "You know they will ask again." I said, "I do." She said, "What will you say?" I said, "I will say no with love." We checked out after breakfast. The desk clerk asked if everything had been to our liking. I said, "Yes, thank you." She tucked 2 small chocolates into our hands and wished us a safe drive. We walked to the car and as I reached for the door handle my phone buzzed again. This time the message was different. "Mom, we need to talk today. I am coming by the house at 6 if you are willing." I typed, "I will be home. Bring only yourself." As Rosalind drove us back along the highway the trees blurred into a green ribbon, and I rested my forehead against the glass and thought of the conversation ahead. I knew there would be apologies. I also knew that an apology without a plan is just a feeling trying on grown clothes. I would ask for action. Ask before assuming. Treat me as a guest, not as staff. Protect me in public. Accept my no without punishment. These were not demands. They were the terms of love in a house where the matriarch stands upright. I closed my eyes and pictured the letter under the blue dish. I saw Derek pick it up and read it and feel the weight of the words. I whispered, "Let this be the beginning of his manhood." Rosalind touched my arm and said, "You did good, sister." I said I did right. "There is a difference." She laughed and said, "You and your preacher sentences." I said, "Truth sounds like that sometimes." We drove the rest of the way in companionable quiet. When the city skyline appeared I did not feel dread. I felt ready. I had chosen peace. I had held it. I could hold it again no matter who walked through my door at 6. When Rosalind dropped me at my porch the sky was the soft blue of evening and the neighbor kids were chasing each other across the sidewalk while their mothers called them in for dinner. And for a moment the ordinary sounds of the block steadied me like a hand at my back because ordinary means the world keeps turning even when your own house is tilted, I stepped inside and the air smelled faintly of lemon from the morning cleaning, and the letter was no longer under the blue dish which told me. Derek had already come by. I set my bag down and made tea and sat in my chair and let the quiet move through the rooms like fresh water, and I thought about the women who taught me that aftermath is where you see people clearly. Not in the storm but in the cleaning up. My phone lit with a slow parade of messages and I read them without rushing. A cousin sent a note that said folks are saying the wedding food was pizzas in boxes stacked like a skyline, and the children were wild and someone knocked over the cake and it looked like a linen avalanche. Betty from church wrote, "Sister, I love you and I am proud of you because sometimes a woman has to make the lesson visible or the lesson will never stick." Carol, the mother I did not know before, reached out again to say a few of us talked in the parking lot and we decided to take our little ones home because the plan was not safe, and I want you to know some of us saw the way you have been treated and it was not right. Michael, the father of the bride, wrote that he spoke to his daughter after the bouquet toss and told her that respect is the only thing that keeps a house from leaning. And though he begged me to come, he also said he understood why I chose not to. I put the phone face down and let those words settle like stones that keep a shoreline from washing away. Then I stood and checked the table where the letter had been, and there on the wood was a faint rectangle of dust and a small crescent where the dish had sat, and that ordinary shape felt like proof that a boundary once laid will leave a mark even after it moves. At 5:40 I turned on the porch light, though the sun had not fully dipped, because light says you are expected but only in the way that honors both of us. At 6 a car door closed and I saw Derek on the walk with his hands empty and his shoulders low. He knocked once like a boy and I opened the door and saw that his eyes were rimmed red and his tie was loose and there was frosting on his sleeve. Like a child who wandered too close to the table, he said, "Hi Mom," in a voice that did not know where to land, and I stepped back and said, "Come in, son," and he came and sat on the end of the sofa like he was afraid to leave a dent. I waited because a mother learns that silence can be the only clean canvas for a confession. He looked at his hands and then up at me and said, "I am sorry," and the words were plain and not dressed in excuses, and I felt them strike true, but I kept still because sorry is a door and I needed to know what rooms were behind it. He said I was blind and I was lazy and I was in love, and I let those things stack up into a wall between me and basic respect for you, and when I read your letter today it felt like you were handing me my name again and telling me to hold it like a man. I asked him what name and he said the name of a son who protects his mother instead of offering her up when it is convenient. He drew a breath and said, "I told Monique I was wrong and that if we are going to be married we cannot begin by using the woman who raised me." He swallowed and added, "And I told her that I would rather postpone a wedding than build a home on disrespect." And I watched his face while he said it and I saw that he was not performing for me, he was measuring himself against a line he should have known all along. I asked him what happened after and he said there were tears and anger and some silence and then more tears, and I said, "Did you defend me in public today?" And he said yes. When her aunt said ugly things about you I told her to stop, and when a guest laughed that the old lady ruined the party I said the old lady is a woman with a name and you will use it, and the guest shut his mouth. I felt my chest loosen a notch and I told him I accept your apology as a first step, but in this house forgiveness is not a rug you roll out once and call the floor finished, it is a path of stones you lay with your hands every day. And he nodded and said I understand, and asked what stones I wanted him to lay. I said you will ask before you assume, and you will accept no without punishment, and you will speak my name with honor when I am there, and when I am not, and you will never again put my labor on a program without my consent, and you will keep the boundary even when it is costly or embarrassing. He said I can do that, and I said you will do it, and he said I will do it, and the difference in those two answers was a small thing but it sounded like a hinge turning. He wiped his face and said I brought nothing but myself because I did not want to try to buy back your trust with flowers or gifts. I wanted you to see that I came with empty hands ready to work, and I said good, because a man builds with empty hands and a clean plan and not with noise. Then he stood and came to my chair and knelt like he was 6 and laid his head on my knee, and I put my hand on his hair, and for a moment the years folded and the room held us both, and I felt the grief of the day climb out of my body the way steam leaves a kettle. After we were quiet a while he said Monique wants to come apologize, and I asked is that your idea or hers, and he said hers. She has been very quiet since the guests left and she asked me for time to gather her words, and I said let her come tomorrow at 4 and come alone, and he said thank you, and I said do not thank me yet, she must bring truth not theater. He nodded and looked around the room as if seeing the shape of his childhood again and said I forgot how safe this house feels, and I said safety is a practice not a feeling, and he smiled a little and said you and your pastor sentences, and I smiled back because I heard Rosalind in that joke and the echo made the room feel full. When he left he did not try to hug me again, he simply squeezed my hand and promised to call in the morning, and I watched his shoulders as he walked to the car, and I saw that they were still low but not collapsed, and I thought good, he is carrying weight, he has After he drove off, I watered the plant in the kitchen window, and the leaves glistened, and I remembered that care looks like small cups of water given on time, not buckets thrown in panic. The next day I woke before the sun and felt a clean thread of purpose pull me to the kitchen, where I made oatmeal with raisins and a pot of coffee, and I ate slowly while reading a few lines from the small Bible that rides in my purse, and I underlined a verse about truth setting free, because freedom is not a storm, it is steady light. Mid-morning a message from Pastor Lawrence arrived asking if I could speak briefly at Women's Day in 2 weeks about boundaries and dignity, and I said yes, as long as we keep names out of it, because the point is the lesson, not the gossip, and he sent a simple amen. Around noon Michael called and asked if he could say something hard, and I said go ahead, and he said my daughter is ashamed and angry, and also scared that she has revealed the worst part of herself, and I told him that what she revealed is not the worst if she chooses to change, and that shame without work is just a mirror, and he was quiet and then thanked me for the mercy in that sentence. At 3:30 I set 2 glasses on the coffee table and a box of tissues within reach, because preparedness is not an invitation, it is respect for the moment. At 4 on the dot the doorbell rang, and when I opened it Monique stood there without makeup, in jeans and a plain blouse, and her eyes looked tired, like someone who finally slept without a performance, and she said hello Miss Cole in a voice that did not try to be sweet, and I stepped aside and said come in and sit wherever you choose, and she perched on the edge of the sofa, and then slid back against the cushion like she had been bracing for a blow that was not coming. I said we will speak plainly and we will keep the temperature low, and she nodded and said I want to apologize for what I said and what I planned, and for laughing while saying it, and for using words like free, and for pretending your love was a service I could schedule. I did not rescue her with that is all right, because it is not. I let the words land and then asked her why she did it, and she said because I have been afraid since I was 15 when my mother died and my father married a woman who did not want me, and I learned to survive by holding the room with charm and controlling the variables, and when I met Derek you were so sure and so loved, and I felt small, and the way I tried to feel big was to push you into the background while I stood in the light. She swallowed and added it is not an excuse, it is a map of how I got lost. I said do you want to be found, and she said yes, and I said then you will have to walk, not pose, and she said I am ready to walk. I told her what I told Derek, that love without respect rots, and that if she wanted a place in my family she must treat the matriarch like a person, not a faucet, and she said I will ask before I assume, and if you say no I will let that be the end, and I will not make Derek punish you with silence or distance. I asked her what she had told Audrey, and she said I called her on Monday and said we were wrong and cruel, and that we used a woman who offered love, and I told her she will not come into your house and speak your name lightly again, and if she does she can visit me somewhere else. I watched her face while she said it, and I saw there was no theater today, only a woman standing on the shaky floorboards of truth and trying to balance. I told her there would be one chance, and that chance would be protected by action. And she said I understand, and asked what action looks like, and I said first you will look me in the eye at church and say good morning and mean it. Second, when people praise what I do you will not take credit. Third, when people attack me you will defend me in the room, and not only on the ride home. And fourth, you will never again make plans with my labor. And then tell Derek to deliver the news as if he is the postman. She nodded and said yes to each, and then asked if she could say something else. And I said say it, and she said I would like to earn the right to call you Mom one day, but today I will call you Miss Cole, and I said that is wise because a title is a bridge, not a costume. We sat in a quiet that did not pinch, and she looked around the room at the photographs and the quilt folded on the chair and the stack of hymnals by the door, and said your house feels like a place where people can learn, and I said it is a place where people can tell the truth and not die of it. Before she left, she asked if there was any way to help make amends, and I said start by telling the story true. When you speak of this weekend say I plan to use my mother-in-law, and she chose dignity, and I faced the cost, and I changed my mind and my habits, and if you tell it that way you will be free of it sooner. She thanked me and stood, and for a moment she hesitated like she might ask to hug me, and then she let the moment pass, and that restraint felt like respect because consent lives even in small gestures. At the door I told her that therapy can be a tool, not a punishment, and she said I already made an appointment for Thursday, and I said good, and she said thank you for opening the door to me, and I said thank you for knocking with care. When she left I watched the street fill with early evening light, and I felt the weight in my chest shift from a stone to a seed, because stones sit heavy and seeds work quietly, and I could sense a small green thing under the soil of this family pushing toward daylight. I brewed tea and sat with my notebook and wrote today's date and the words first apology and underlined it twice because names matter and moments matter, and I thought about the women who will hear this story on Women's Day, and how I will tell them that the truth hurts but it also heals, and that a clean boundary is a kind gift to everyone in the room. The kettle clicked off and I poured the water and breathed in the steam and said aloud to the empty house, we are not finished and we are not broken, we are building. The day after Monique came to apologize I woke with a steadier breath and a plan to test whether words would grow legs. I brewed coffee and stood at the window while the neighborhood shook itself awake. Then I called her and said meet me at June's diner at noon because tables in daylight make truth easier to hold. She arrived early and chose a booth by the window, no makeup, simple earrings, eyes clear but tender. When I sat she reached for the menu then set it down as if to show she would not hide behind small talk. I said today is not for sorrow but for structure and she nodded. The waitress poured water and asked about specials and Monique said whatever Miss Cole is having I will have too, and the way she said it carried respect without sugar. I told her this is what rebuilding looks like, a series of honest meals where no one scripts for power. I asked if she kept the therapy appointment and she said yes. The session was messy and the chair held a woman I have not seen since I was 15 and I left with homework and I will do it. Then she pulled a notepad from her bag and said I wrote down what you asked, ask before assuming, accept no without punishment, defend you in public not just later, never assign your labor and send Derek to deliver the news. I added one more line and she waited like a student. I said when people praise what I do give credit and if I forget to receive it remind me to take it. She wrote it down and said may I ask something and I said yes. She said will you tell me when I misstep so I do not drift back into old habits. I said I will tell you once and then I will step back because my job is not to be your teacher without invitation. She said that is fair and brave. The food came and we ate in a quiet that did not strain. Halfway through she looked up and said I want to tell you something that may sound small but it is big to me. Yesterday I removed a folder from my phone where I kept inspirational pictures of weddings and family brunches and clean kitchens because I realized that my real life was buckling under the weight of a pretend life and I do not want a pretty picture that requires me to treat people like props. I set down my fork and felt a warmth rise under my ribs because that is a twist the audience does not always see. The villain in Act 1 chooses work in Act 2. I said good. Afterward we paid separately, a tiny ritual to mark that I am not her bank. And when we stepped out into the noon sun she asked may I walk you to your car and I said yes and we crossed the lot like two women who understood that trust moves in inches and not in leaps. On the way she said Pastor Lawrence invited me to Women's Day because he heard you will speak and I plan to sit in the back and listen. I said you may sit where you like but do not flinch at the truth. She said I will not flinch, I will learn, and she drove off. When Sunday came the church smelled like polished wood and perfume and fresh paper and the women wore dresses that looked like joy stitched into fabric. I arrived early with a small stack of notes and a heart that knew what it wanted to say. In the fellowship hall a banner read Boundaries Bless a Home and on the stage sat a simple wooden podium and a vase of lilies. The choir hummed while people found their seats. I spotted Rosalind near the front and she gave me that look that says you are not alone. I saw Carol from the wedding standing with two other mothers and when she caught my eye she pressed a hand to her heart as if to say we saw you and we will hold this with you. At the back I saw Monique slip into a chair. Head bowed for a moment then lifted. Pastor Lawrence welcomed us and spoke briefly about wisdom passing from one generation to the next and then he called my name. I walked to the podium without hurry because pause is power. I looked out at faces that had watched me grow older and still expect me to tell the truth clean. I began with a breath and said I want to talk about how love turns into duty when we are not careful and how duty turns into erasure when we forget to say no. I did not name anyone and I did not need to because the lesson stood by itself. I told them about a woman who planned a buffet and a son who trusted habit more than respect and a conversation on a patio that turned a mother into the help. I told them about a letter placed under a blue dish and a spa by a lake and a phone that would not stop ringing and a decision to answer without surrender. The room was silent except for the creak of pews as people leaned closer. I said love is not servitude and a boundary is not betrayal and if you treat a woman like she is invisible she will teach you how to see. A murmur rose like a soft wind. I said sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your child is to make the lesson cost them something. Not to punish but to teach the price of respect. An older woman in the second row whispered amen and another nodded and pressed a tissue to her eyes. I spoke about receipts and policies and how documentation is not bitterness, it is clarity. I spoke about the temptation to fix everything and how fixing yourself is a holy act. I told them I did not shout, I did not curse, I did not drag anyone on social media. I chose peace that stood up straight and let consequences do the preaching. At one point I paused and asked the room, have you ever said no and felt the floor steady under your feet and hands went up across the hall? The most dramatic turn came when Michael Ballantyne stood up without being called on and asked permission to speak. Pastor tilted his chin and said briefly, sir. Michael said, I am the father of the bride and I failed my daughter by raising a woman who thought she could use another woman's love like free gas. I want to apologize to this congregation and to Miss Cole and to my own child for not teaching that respect is the rent you pay to live in a family. The room drew a collective breath. Such public confession is rare. And when it arrives it bends the air. I said thank you sir and I accept that as part of a larger repair and he sat with his face wet and his shoulders squared. Then Carol stood and said I was a mother at that wedding and I left because I did not feel my child was safe and I want to thank Miss Cole for teaching me with her actions that I can leave whenever a room expects me to disappear into duty. The choir hummed again and it sounded like a net catching people who might have fallen. I closed with a simple story from my diner days about looking up from a busy line and realizing that the person who needed help most was the woman in the mirror, and how when I gave her water and rest she could feed everyone better. I said boundaries bless a home and bless a church and bless a city. I said we can be kind and be clear in the same sentence. I said young women are watching and older women are tired and we owe each other a better lesson. I ended with a question, did this speak to you and where are you listening from? And the room answered with hands and with a quiet that meant yes. After the program people lined up to hug me but I offered hand clasps and shoulder touches instead because tenderness does not always need to crush. Several women whispered thank you for giving me the words I could not find and a man said my mother needed this in 1989 and I wish somebody had preached it then. In the corner I saw Monique approaching slow. She waited for the line to thin then said Miss Cole may I say something into your ear? I nodded and she said I sat there and thought about every time I put a woman in the background and called it planning. I will not do that again. Then she turned and found Carol and introduced herself and said I am sorry I was part of making your day unsafe and Carol pulled her into a quick firm hug that looked like a door opening. Later in the week I received an email from the church office asking for permission to post the audio of the talk on the website. I wrote back yes with one request, do not include names or pictures, just the title boundaries bless a home and the sound of women breathing when they hear relief. The audio went up and by evening my phone buzzed with messages from friends in other cities. One said I played it for my daughter and she pressed pause twice to cry and then pressed play again, and another said I left a job after listening because I realized I had been paying rent with my soul and I wanted to live somewhere else. Not long after that the community center asked me to teach a small workshop on documenting your no, and Rosalind joked that I would need a chalkboard and I said I need only a table and a pot of coffee and a stack of pens. The public part of the exposure did not feel like shaming, it felt like sunlight on a bruise that was already healing. It also carried a surprise. People began telling their own stories and in telling them they owned them. There was a man who said his mother never sat down at a family dinner in 30 years and now he cooks on Sundays while she tells stories. There was a young bride who decided to hire childcare for her party and budget for it before flowers because she did not want joy built on unpaid labor. And in every story I heard a small echo of my own, and the echo did not hurt, it harmonized. Still I kept my own guard up because public applause can make a woman forget private promises. I reminded myself that the point was not to be celebrated but to live free. I set timers on my phone to ask do I still mean it, and twice a week I wrote a line in my notebook that began with today I chose dignity by and filled it with a small act. Sometimes it was as simple as saying no to an extra committee. Sometimes it was as quiet as resting in the afternoon without apology. The final note in this chapter arrived at the grocery store on a Tuesday when I turned into the baking aisle and nearly ran into Audrey. She froze, then lowered her eyes, then lifted them and said, Miss Cole, I owe you an apology and I do not deserve your time, but I would like to tell you I am embarrassed by what I said and I am working on my envy, and I hope one day to show you by how I live that I mean this. I studied her face and said thank you for the apology and I wish you well, and then I pushed my cart forward because forgiveness does not always include a reunion and grace sometimes looks like allowing space. That evening Michael called to say the family had a hard talk and had made changes to how they speak about me, and he wanted me to know that not every fix is theatrical. Some are quiet like a house being jacked slowly back to level. I thanked him and hung up and stood at the sink and felt a wave of emotion roll through me. Not triumph and not pity. Something like relief that the truth carried itself without me pushing. At the end of the week pastor sent a note that 3 different women had requested counseling after hearing the talk, and he thanked me for telling the truth without spilling blood. I wrote back that the truth does its own cutting and its own stitching and we are just the needle. The next Sunday I watched Monique at service from across the sanctuary. She greeted elders by name. She offered her seat to a woman with a cane. She did not hover near Derek as if afraid I would claim him. After benediction she crossed the aisle to me and said good morning Miss Cole, and I said good morning Monique, and we both smiled because a small thing had become a new road. The public exposure had not scorched the ground, it had warmed it, now seeds could take. And as I walked home with my Bible in my bag and the sun on my shoulder I knew that the story had turned another corner without noise. The woman who was almost erased had become visible to herself again, and the community had seen her too, and that visibility was not loud, it was steady. And in that steadiness the next part of the work would live. A year after the wedding that cracked open so many truths, I woke before sunrise and stood at my kitchen window with a cup of tea and watched the street take a slow breath, and for once I did not feel rushed by anyone else's needs because I had learned to let my no be a sentence that did not require a long explanation, and in that quiet I felt something like a new backbone forming from the small choices I kept making. On the bookshelf sat the first copy of my little cookbook and memoir with a simple title, Cooking with Love, Serving with Dignity. And when I opened it to the page with my mother's handwriting copied in neat print, I felt a wave of thanks for the women who taught me to season food and season boundaries. Derek and Monique came by that afternoon with a basket of pears and a note that said, "We are learning," and the basket was not a bribe and not an apology but a sign of rhythm as steady as a porch swing. And when they left, I noticed that they had washed the cups and put them back in the right cabinet without being asked, and the smallness of that act felt like a door staying open. Some Sundays I speak at the community center to a circle of women who carry stories like heavy laundry, and we sit at folding tables with pens and coffee and talk about receipts and choices and the practice of saying no and resting and asking for help without shame, and after each class someone lingers to whisper a secret and a promise, and we celebrate not with noise but with calendars marked with blank days that belong to the body that has worked so long. Rosalind jokes that I turned a storm into a recipe card and that the ingredients are simple: paper and voice and rest, and I tell her she is right and that the oven is time and the timer is conscience. Monique writes me short updates from therapy with one clear sentence: "I told the truth about my envy," or "I called my stepmother and listened without armor," or "I offered to hire childcare for a friend's party so that Joy did not need the unpaid labor of love," and those notes land like small stones that keep a river from washing away good soil. Michael calls once a month to say hello and to report that he is practicing respect as a language at home, and that he catches himself faster when old habits arrive, and when I hang up I feel a quiet gratitude for men who learn late and still learn. I keep the coral dress on a hook in my bedroom, and I have worn it twice this year, once to a concert by the lake with Rosalind where we ate cold fried chicken from a paper box and sang along to old songs, and once to the baptism of a neighbor child where the mother insisted I stand in the front row because she said the woman who teaches dignity belongs in the picture, and I felt shy and proud at the same time. Not every day is easy, and a few were hard, with the kind of tired that comes after you hold a line in a room where some people still expect women to pour and smile and disappear, and in those hours I sit at my table and write a simple sentence: "Today I chose dignity by," and then I finish it, even if the choice was as small as turning off my phone for an afternoon or taking a nap without justifying it or asking for help with a window I could not lift alone. I keep certain mementos in the manila folder labeled boundaries: the policy pages that saved me money, the letter I wrote to my son, a printout of the talk I gave at church, and a picture of my husband tucked in the back with a note in my own hand that says, "You would have been proud of me." And when I open that folder I feel held by the years we built and by the courage I found when I thought I had none left. Some evenings Derek stops by after work and sits at the table and tells me about a project or a problem without asking me to fix it, and when he rises to go he kisses my forehead and says, "Thank you for teaching me how to be a man who does not hide behind his mother's labor," and I answer with a smile that says, "We are both still learning." Monique now greets me in public with warmth that is simple and unperformed, and when I cook at her house I sit down to eat first by her insistence, and if I lift a plate she points me back to my chair and laughs softly and says, "We planned for this," and I feel an easing that loosens old knots. One afternoon she brought me a small wrapped box, and inside was a bookmark made of pressed flowers and a narrow ribbon, and on the card she had written the line, "You gave me a boundary," and it became a bridge, and I sat there and cried for a minute because the sentence carried a twist I did not see at first, and it meant the plot did not end with revenge, it turned toward repair. At church people still ask about the talk, and Pastor Lawrence keeps a copy in a folder, and he says he rereads the part about fixing yourself first when meetings run long and feelings run hot, and I tell him that if leaders keep their joy fresh their people will not taste bitterness in the bread. Somewhere between the quiet morning walks and the slow circles of conversation a new identity settled into place, not only mother and widow and neighbor and cook, but something like matriarch, teacher, friend, and I tried not to hold that word too tightly because titles can harden the heart if they are worn like armor, so I wore it like a sweater when the air turned cool and I took it off when the day grew warm. Financially I am careful and steady, and I track what I give, and to whom, and when I volunteer I pick roles with time limits and clear stops, and I no longer say yes from fear that love will leave me if I do not perform, and I have learned to trust love that stays when you are seated. In my journal I keep a list of sentences that guided me this year. Truth tells on itself. Respect is a practice. Love without boundaries rots. Kindness without clarity exhausts a home, and public dignity begins in private rooms. I still believe in happy endings, but I learned to prefer honest continuations, and I think the women who listen to my stories believe the same because they nod when I say that rebirth is a daily act, like making the bed and opening the windows to let in fresh air and choosing fruit instead of stale sadness and lighting a candle for the memory that still hurts but no longer rules. The neighborhood shifted in small ways. People wave more and check on one another with a care that feels practical and whole. And when the community center hosted a workshop on elder respect, the room filled and men came too, and the best part was a teenage boy who stayed after to say, "My grandmother never sits and I want to change that," and I told him to cook breakfast on Sunday and put a chair at the head of the table and ask her to bless the food, and he grinned like a man given a plan. If there is a moral, it is not a pretty lesson framed in gold, it is a plain truth written in steady ink, that a woman who sees herself clearly can weather betrayal, can gather evidence, can say no, can take a drive to the lake and turn off a phone, can require payment for labor if labor is required, can forgive without surrender, can let consequences preach, and can rebuild with her hands and her friends and her church and her son. The twist that still takes my breath is simple: the same mouth that once planned to use me now speaks my name with care, and the same son who assumed my labor now guards my rest. And the same community that knew me as the woman who always came through now knows me as the woman who comes when it is right and stays seated when it is not, and nothing collapsed when I stopped performing because what was real remained. Did this speak to you today, my friends?